Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here and grateful that I have the opportunity to speak with you, and I hope we will be dialoguing throughout my brief presentation. Originally, I was going to be doing this with another member of the planning committee, but some conflicts arose for him scheduling-wise, so we couldn't have that perspective, which was unfortunate, but those things kind of happen, so I'm going to have to go with my strengths, and then Norma will be talking about her area of expertise. Originally, when we were talking about this theme of enoughness and sufficiency, one of the areas that they came up was the area of labor or work, and the dignity of work and the dignity of workers and the rights of workers and how important that was. And I don't know if Angela was able to make some copies of some of the scriptural passages, but I'd like to start with one just to kind of give us a biblical point of reference. And this is an oldie but a goodie, as we say, the third commandment. As, from Exodus, remember the Sabbath day, and this, I believe, these texts are taken from the New American Bible, the American Catholic Bishop's translation. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, either you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your work animal, or the resident alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but on the seventh day he rested. This is why the Lord has blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And really, with some of our themes about enoughness and abundance, it was interesting to me that from the earliest understanding of sacred scripture, we have parameters put on work, that there is such a thing as a time to work and a time to rest, and that it's one of the commandments of the Lord to Israel, to all of us, to refrain from work, that there is such a thing as too much time in the field, too much time working, too much time toiling, and to keep a balance and a boundary on that was preeminent. And what I always used to tell the college kids when they came to confession, I'd say, kids, the sexual sins are only 20% of the top 10. So remember some of those other ones. And this is one of those that we want to keep in mind, that to keep holy the idea of Sabbath and rest in the Lord, and to kind of frame our understanding of the dignity of work, the importance of sanctifying not only our work, but the workers, of realizing that context. And just a little housekeeping, a caveat. I'm a little visually impaired, so if you have a question and you think I'm ignoring you, just assume I can't see your hand in the air, so you want to make sure to shout out if I don't get to you right away. And I may, depending on how comfortable I am, just kind of walk around a little bit so that I can see the faces of people. But what I'd like to talk about is, as I said, the area of my strength, which is Catholic social teaching from the Roman Catholic perspective. A lot of times, we hear the media talking about, the Vatican's perspective on things, and they usually deal with controversial issues. Unfortunately, what is not as widely known and widely understood by Catholics and non-Catholics alike is the rich tradition in the Catholic Church of social teaching that involves the same level of authority as some of the more controversial teachings, but often gets ignored or gets second string because it's not as, to use the marketing term, they're not as sexy as an issue as, say, issues around right to life or contraception and things that, are a little more controversial. And what I always used to point out to people is that there's just as much authority behind these social teachings as there is for some of these more politically controversial teachings. And really, they are controversial, and they should be given the same merit and weight that we give to some of the more headline-grabbing teachings from the Vatican. And what I always enjoy about them is that they really are teachings that are much more applicable. While we may not agree on everything, a lot of what the Catholic Church has put forth for social doctrine, I think is very accessible to a wide audience of not only Christians, but non-Christians, non-believers, because they basically touch at the fundamental foundations of what it is to be a just society, a society that takes into account the rights and the needs of all people. And I'd like to basically, in a thumbnail sketch, trace a little bit, and if some of this is repetitive for many of you, my apologies up front, but just to give a thumbnail sketch of some of the historical context, touch on 10 principles that have come out over the little more than a century of official Catholic teaching, and kind of highlight three periods in history that I believe are noteworthy, and those being kind of the beginning, what we call, the first great teaching from the Vatican, which would be in 1891, Leo XIII's encyclical. In Latin, it was called Rerum Novarum. It's on the dignity of work. The Second Vatican Council, which was in the 1960s, and more recently, some of the important teachings from John Paul II in the 80s and 90s, which really were some of his most important teachings that he gave, and this one of the most traveled leaders of the Catholic Church, and oftentimes not given enough attention to the many social teachings that he offered. And to kind of sketch a little bit of the social context, what's interesting about social teaching, and I remember our first talk, I wasn't here last week because I had a conflict at work, but our first talk, if we remember, the economist who spoke from Harvard, she talked about how it's really the faith traditions that have called us back to a sense of honesty and integrity during some of the economic crises, that it was the faith traditions that really stood up for the rights of workers. It was the faith traditions that really spurred us on to the movement to abolish slavery, the faith traditions that really took into account the needs of the worker in the Industrial Revolution. And nowhere, I think, is that as apparent as in the development of the Church's social teachings from a Catholic perspective. In 1891, we had kind of the high water mark of the Gilded Age, corporate capitalism. Monopolists had kind of free reign of the American culture. European Industrial Revolution had basically created a factory culture, and throughout the 19th century, you had tremendous amounts of workers being basically oppressed by the means of capital, the means of production in the industrialized world. It was a new era for both capital and labor alike. And during this time, of course, by the middle of the 19th century, you had Karl Marx writing the Communist Manifesto. You had the socialist reform movements throughout Europe. You had labor unions beginning in England and beginning in the United States, some of which were considered radical and to be opposed. And during this time, by 1891, Leo XIII, who was the Pope at that time, decided that it was high time for the Church to write some teachings about the rights of workers. And that's really where our social teaching began in the Catholic Church. Although we had understandings from theology, understandings from Scripture, it was really at that point in 1891 when the Vatican kind of lent its teaching authority and said, we have to say something about the conditions of labor, the conditions that have been unjustly forced upon so many millions of people. And with that encyclical in 1891, the Church kind of entered with both feet the dialogue about the rights of workers. And that's where, the first principle of the 10 really was articulated at one of the highest levels, and it really was, on the dignity of work and the dignity of human workers. And that principle of human dignity, which is rooted in the Catholic understanding of being created in the image and likeness of God, was really something that, at least from Leo XIII's perspective, was important for him to put forth for two reasons. One is he saw that unbridled market capitalism was really destroying, vast numbers of workers, oppressing vast numbers of human beings who were laboring under adverse conditions, who were not being given the opportunity to really advance, who were not giving the opportunity to benefit from the work that they were doing, that it actually, the opposite was occurring. They were being more and more deprived of the fruits of their labor, and it was becoming, the privilege of the wealthy class, the privilege of the wealthy capitalists. And really, this was where the church decided that, there was a certain inequality along class versus wealth and poverty, and that was fairly revolutionary for a monarchy, which is what the Catholic Church is. And for them to basically say, the wealthiest classes cannot always take advantage of the poorer classes. In fact, he made it a point to make it clear that this was an unjust system. Also was the church's caution to some of the Marxist and socialist teachings that were being espoused, because they felt that these teachings did not uphold the human person either, that they basically were talking about the state comes first. They were not founded in religious tradition. They weren't founded in a belief in God. And so there was a caution there. So you had the two things that were really being addressed were the abuses of capitalism and the church's apprehension towards Marxism. But he also recognized that what was coming from this was the oppressed workers' desire to experience some sense that they were being heard and that they were their concerns were being addressed. What's interesting to me is that at the height of the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century, you finally have a rather elderly pope, finally have somebody saying, we have to take into account the needs of the oppressed labor, those who are working to make the society, that those needs are real, and we can't ignore them anymore as a body of faith. And that really was kind of the benchmark for Catholic social teaching. It's an interesting time in the church, because during that time, the Vatican had kind of been divested of all its secular power. There wasn't any more papal states. The Vatican was kind of rendered powerless in terms of its secular political power. But this is really what I would argue is one of the real examples of how the church had started to begin to realize, hey, we can teach, though. We can invite people to see things a little differently, and really began to offer that not only to Catholics, but later on, as we'll see, to all people. And this was an important document because it basically enshrined the reality that every human being has the right to work, and that work is something that is good, and it makes us who we are as human beings. It allows us to be people who are creative, like the God who created us. It allows us to participate in the building of society. It allows us to participate in the building of the family. It sustains us. So it really was an opportunity for the church to affirm that at the highest levels. And throughout the 20th century, there was always an echo back to that understanding in the face of some of the continued injustices and abuses that came about. And you'll see through, if you haven't already studied some of this, you see throughout the 20th century, even into the 21st century, that the church kind of takes the opportunity on the anniversary of Rerum Novarum to kind of do a check and to see where we're at. And the next one would have been in 1931 with Quadragesimus Anno, the 40th anniversary, that Pius XI, and that was in response to the Great Depression. and also the rise of the fascist regimes in Europe. And this was really when the Vatican decided that, okay, we see that we've made some progress. There's been some labor unions, and there's been some understanding that the rights of workers have to be protected. But in 1931, there was the rise of the fascists in Germany, the Nazis in Germany, the fascists in Italy and Spain, and there was also the Great Depression. So they began to expand the understanding of what was wrong with the oppressive systems, and to actually begin to articulate structures of sin. And that idea that there were actually systems in place, namely, for example, the statist political philosophies of fascism that were structurally unjust, especially to the poor and to the oppressed and to those that were targeted. And often, in the case of the Nazis, of course, there was practice of genocide, and the Vatican certainly in 1931 saw this as a serious threat to the right of every human being, the right of workers, the oppression of individual rights, the oppression of people to have and to enjoy the fruits of their own labor and their own property, their own ability to have and to benefit from the dignity of their work, and to have and to determine their own fate in terms of their livelihood, not only their work, but what that work produced, their family life. And it was here also that Pius XI articulated another principle, and the principle of subsidiarity, which is one of the founding principles of Catholic social teaching. Subsidiarity basically meaning that the problems of a given group or a given society or a given culture should be determined at the lowest, at the local level. The old adage from Tip O'Neill, I believe it was, who said all politics is local, and this would kind of be the Catholic version of that problems and conditions that affect people should be solved at the level that they're most immediately experienced, so that local communities, local labor unions, local workers should be consulted in their own in addressing their own problems, and this was really the contribution, if you will, that Pius XI in the 1930s offered to Catholic social teaching. And then throughout the 20th century was the great explosion of technology and some of the scientific advancements, cultural intermingling, globalization, modernization, the rise of the nuclear states and the proliferation of war and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And as I was researching this, it's fascinating to kind of get some of these, and Google makes everybody smarter. At least it makes me smarter. So, and you learn little things that you didn't know. And in 1950, the world's population was 2.5 billion. So it took us from, whenever all this started, to 1950 to get to 2.5 billion, and we're at what, 8.5 billion now, somewhere? 7.5 billion? Yeah, that's exponential, and what was interesting to me is that even in 1950, we were talking in terms of a population explosion, and how there were great disparities between rich and poor. And by the 1960s, when the Church embarked on the Second Vatican Council, you had John the 23rd, a very forward-looking Pope, and Paul VI, another forward-looking Pope, who began to realize that all these things were somehow interconnected, and that along with the principles of the dignity of the human person, the principles of solidarity, there were also important principles. Not only was there a disparity between classes, but there was also the recognition that there was a disparity between nations, that there were rich and poor nations in the world, that rich and poor nations had somehow evolved, that we had a first world, a second world, and a third world where people were oppressed, people were exploited, people were taken advantage of by richer nations, by more powerful nations, by nations that were using third world nations to basically maneuver and engineer their own geopolitical aims. And I'm thinking, of course, of the old Cold War era when the United States and the Soviet bloc countries were basically fighting war by proxy, which is one of the phrases that the Vatican used, with other nations, with poor nations. And they were also doing it with nations that were exploited because of their cheap labor and cheap available resources, nations in the third world, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Vatican began to see that and to understand that and to really address that. And in the Second Vatican Council, some of the more interesting things was, first you had John the 23rd's landmark encyclical Mater et Magistra, which is Mother and Teacher, and it was landmark in 1961, 20 years after Pius XI's encyclical, and also on the anniversary of Leo XIII's encyclical. Really, you had an understanding at that point from the Vatican that, you know, the teachings of the Church were there to point out not only the structures of sins, but the way that people had to respond to them. That this was the beginning, and later on with some of the Church's teachings in the Second Vatican Council, that Christians and all believers, and it's interesting that one of the documents of the Second Vatican Council was the first church document addressed to all peoples. It was not just addressed to Catholics, or not just addressed to bishops. Previously, the Pope would write to his brother bishops, would write to all people, all Catholics. And the Vatican in 1960, I'm going to say the date escapes me, 63 or 64, with Gaudium et Spes, addressed it to all people. And that was the understanding that we had an obligation as people of faith, regardless of our creed, to take into account the rights and the needs of all peoples, the oppressed, the oppression of labor, the oppression of the workers throughout the world, factory workers, farm workers, workers that were exploited with poor wages, poor working conditions, poor health care, things that, you know, we kind of hear about today, but it was really the first time in the 1960s that the Church had called all of us as people of faith to kind of see that as part of our obligation as believers to take that into consideration. And again, I was reminded of our first presentation that not only are we the people of faith, the ones who are supposed to embrace these principles, but also we're the ones really that articulate them. And I remember when Angela and I were talking, and sometimes the planning group, this is a little bit of an aside, but the planning group, we were kind of hopeful that it wasn't just, you know, preaching to the choir, you know, because we always get, you people are wonderful. You come to our presentations, and that's what I'm saying. I love preaching to the choir, because they're the ones that make the music, first of all. You know they're going to be there, and you know they're invested. And if we don't nourish each other, then we're not going to be able to nourish people that might not even know they're hungry. You know what I'm saying? And oftentimes, this is an opportunity for us to kind of reinvigorate ourselves. And rather than to get discouraged that it's just the same people, really, we're the ones that have to keep that energy level going. And it's great to have that opportunity and to rehearse as a choir and to do those things and to be able to share from our shared knowledge, our shared resources, our shared opportunities. And since I'm running out of time, and after the Vatican Council, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s were really an explosion of kind of an awareness in the Catholic Church globally that social justice issues were at the forefront of Catholic teaching. This is when conferences of Catholic bishops, the United States Catholic Conference, and I believe it was 1986, issued Economic Justice for All, a wonderful document that has not gotten nearly the credit that it deserves, at least in my opinion. The Australian bishops were writing, the Mexican bishops were writing, the Synod of Bishops in Rome for the world was writing, the Vatican, the Pope was writing, and John Paul II, really, some of his earliest encyclicals and most forceful ones were on social teaching. And perhaps one of the most interesting ones was on social concerns. In Latin, it was Sollicitudo Rei Socialis, and I practiced that several times to get the pronunciation right. And because my Latin couldn't get me on the bus in ancient Rome, I assure you. And
can you spell that?
What's that?
Can you spell that for me?
I could. I could, actually. And that is where he took from his own experience, and again, the experience of the individuals, as the Polish movement Solidarity helped for the liberation of Poland from the Soviet Union. He took that principle and applied it to Catholic social teaching, so that solidarity became one of the other principles in the Catholic Church. And solidarity basically meaning that we're all brothers and sisters. That by virtue of the fact that we are human beings, that we have dignity as God's children, that we have an obligation to look at the structures of sin, that oppress human beings, especially the human worker, that we have an obligation in solidarity with one another to look at that and to support one another. And this is where he began to articulate some of the catchphrases of Catholic social teaching. For example, the preferential option for the poor. Perhaps one of the most important understandings that John Paul II articulated, that really believers have an obligation as a society, a duty to look at the world through the eyes of the poor. That if there are the rich and the powerful, there is conversely the poor and the powerless. And that if we're going to be all in this together, human beings, each with an equal dignity, co-heirs to salvation, that we all have the divine image within us, that we have an obligation to the poor and the powerless to make sure that we take into account their rights, their dignity, their understanding of things, and to listen to them, not to simply go and impose our understanding. And I see this all the time at the Franciscan Center. At the local level, I think I know what programs people need. I think I know what people want. I think I know what people are going to enjoy. And really, it's the citizens of Baltimore who tell you what they want, what they need, and what's going to make their lives better. And really, it's always a lesson for me to be able to sit down and to listen to people who come into the center and to know what it is that they need in their given situation to help improve their life and to give them an opportunity to experience not only the dignity that's inherently theirs, but the opportunity to share that with their families. And really that's one of the great lessons in humility for me and for all of us, is to really listen to people who have less and to realize, hey, they have the same aspirations, the same desires, the same interest in promoting their own dignity and their own family values that we do. And sometimes we forget that people who have the privilege of enjoying an abundance, that we think, well, we know better and we can just donate and help out. And really, it's just as important to be able to listen and to let the people who need things to tell us which we need. And you look at it from a perspective like healthcare. There's nothing as important as being an advocate for your own healthcare, an advocate for your own resources, so that you're participating in that yourself. So those really are kind of very briefly some of the biggest biggest principles that we have taken from Catholic social teaching. The dignity of the human person. The other one that I didn't touch on was the common good, that we all have an opportunity and an obligation to promote the welfare of society. The principle of solidarity, which I mentioned, subsidiarity, which I mentioned, and the purpose of the social order, which I kind of touched on, really that the purpose of the social order is to promote the human person. And the purpose of government is to promote the good of the person, that kind of against the statist understanding of communism or fascism, that really it's the human person that's first. And really that's important, because capital is at the service of labor, not the other way around. And one thing that's not always evident, and it's not always upheld. In fact, in our legal system, that's not true. if you have a contract with somebody and you're the equity partner and I'm the working partner, equity trumps labor in common law. It's one thing we learned in contracts is that, you know, if you put the money up for the business and I do all the work and we have a falling out, the courts are going to side with the person who puts up the money, not the person who puts up the labor. So we have a long way to go, I think, as a society to kind of embrace that understanding that, you know, the means of production, the means of capital are really at the service of the human beings who use them and produce with them. And that's why we have to acknowledge that with workers, so that people have an opportunity not only to be a part of the means of production, but can benefit from it. That's why, from the Vatican's point of view, private property is not a bad thing. Everybody should have an opportunity to benefit from the fruits of their labor. So I think I'm going to stop here because I feel like I'm just talking at you a little bit, and to kind of give you an opportunity maybe to ask me some questions, but even more importantly for my benefit is to hear from you what in your tradition, and to let the group hear from you what in your tradition would be complementary to some of the things I've mentioned, or the same, or better, or how your tradition understands some of these principles or articulates some of these principles. So, and then we'll be able to, after that, we'll be able to hear from Ms. Flores Lopez. No, I'm sorry. Did I get that right? I got that right. Got that right. So thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome. So as was mentioned at the beginning, I do come from a family of farm workers. So a lot of this stuff that you see here very much is true to my experience, to what I went through, to now that I go to talk to other kids, the very, very same type of experience. And when I do go back and talk to my parents as well, this is very similar to what was happening to them back when they were kids too. I come from many generations of farm workers, of migrant farm workers. My grandparents did this, and we used to go up there with my grandparents, with my parents. Me and my 4 sisters, we've all gotten to go do farm work as well. As a matter of fact, my parents, both of them that were born in the U.S., were pulled out of school at very, very young ages. My mom in 2nd grade, my father in 6th grade. And both of them were pulled out of school to start working out in the fields, and continue to do that to this day. They're still farm workers. So even though I look very well put together, you know, don't let this fool you. I was out there exactly like that little girl, dressed up in those clothes, living in those same type of homes, having beat up cars where everybody was trying to squeeze together, you know, doing the long cross-country trips, trying to just help our parents be able to make ends meet. So as I mentioned, you know, that was, you know, it was very, very difficult to have to be, as a kid, to grow up and to always be pulled out of your home, to go to be away from your family and friends, to go to a different state, a different part of the country, out in the rural areas where people don't speak your language, places where we're away from all different types of services, hoping for the best, hoping for a decent housing, hoping for running water, hoping for a decent work job that was continuous, that would be able to help us make ends meet. You know, for us as kids, it was stressful. We knew the situation. We knew the realities. And I can't even imagine what kind of position it would make it would put my parents to have to take their kids with them to these different areas when themselves they don't speak English either. They have a very hard time. They can barely kind of make some stuff out. You know, we come from a family where my father's the only one that drives, and there were times when my father got really, really sick in the middle of the cross-country trip. But what were we supposed to do when we would break down out in the middle of Kansas on our way up and not know anybody, or even scarier when we're in some of the outskirts of Arkansas? Not to offend anybody if they're from Arkansas, beautiful state, but there's some places that were pretty scary that we didn't know how we were going to be treated, where we could run to get help. And you know, we would have to be moving around. We would have to pack up as much as we could. We had our little bag and leave all of our things behind. If it stayed behind, it stayed behind. We're not going to turn around, you know, because you forgot your favorite pair of shoes or anything like that. And not that you would even need nice pair of shoes because you have nowhere to go during the summer months because you're going to be busy working. So although I started working officially, on the record, at the age of 12, which is where it's legally allowed for me to be working out in the fields, I was already very familiar with the work. My parents had nowhere to leave me, so they would sometimes take me out to the fields with them on the weekends, or maybe after school that we would get dropped off where my parents were at. Since we would live out in apple orchards, they would just kind of, they would see our parents there, and they would, I guess our bus driver would take our word on. It's like, my parents are there, can you just leave us there? And they're like, sure. And so we would just get off and go there and help out our parents with little things, and that's how you see a lot of these kids start off with doing things like taking them water, taking them the buckets that they need, little things like that. And then before you know it, pick up the apples that fell around the tree, or help us with the low-hanging fruit, and just kind of started working from there, but you're still being exposed to the same elements, the same heat that's out there. It's hard to visualize that. But in reality, what this little girl standing is in 100+ degree heat out there with no shade and having to be doing that day after day, hour after hour. It's hard to imagine her. But the reality is she's probably out there for her 7th hour, out there, being stooped over after working out there for a couple of weeks, because that's what it was like to me. We didn't have a Sunday off. We didn't have a Saturday off. We didn't have sometimes any days off for 3 weeks in a row, 4 weeks in a row, that we wouldn't have any days. And it was very hard because after work, my dad would have to try to rush to go to the grocery store to grab a few more things and be able to make it back because the season was on. And that's where we needed to be. So as a 12-year-old, having to be out there working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, it can really put a lot of strain on your body. And I blame all that as to why I stayed this small. That's my excuse. They didn't give me an opportunity to grow. Being stooped over and having to carry that heavy stuff and all those pesticides. I mean, those are all the same elements that you're exposed to, whether you're a 7-year-old running around trying to help out your parents, or you're a 12-year-old working full-time, or you're an adult. You still have the heat. You still have the pesticides and the other chemicals that are being spread out there. You still have the heavy machinery. Every time I watch this video, I always cringe seeing that little boy running next to that big tractor. It's just, and that's how we grew up around out there. And that's where the accidents do happen. It does happen. And so those are the realities that you see a lot out there in the fields. And like I said, those are the same realities that I felt. And if you talk to my parents, it hurts them to know that they had to take us out there. That it was a struggle that they had. What parent wants to have their kids running around out there and doesn't want to be able to make ends meet? My parents still struggle today to help make ends meet. And as you guys know, working in a nonprofit, I don't make hardly enough to be able to make enough for my parents to pull them out of the fields and have myself be able to make ends meet. It's just, I'm not there. And who knows when I'll be able to get there. But that's a little bit of what it's been like for me. And those are the same stories that we hear today from a lot of these kids, where their intentions, their hearts are exactly in the same place where mine were. I'm trying to be able to help out our families. So let me get started a little bit about where that has brought me. So working out in the fields, it was a huge struggle to try to be able to, get my education, but I managed to. I was able to with a lot of these support programs that are very quickly disappearing, unfortunately. And you guys hear that a lot around Congress and about where the social services are and a lot of those types of support that is very, very quickly disappearing for folks like me who otherwise I probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for those types of support. But I was able to make it through high school, even though I did start school late every single year. I would sometimes leave early too. We would leave in April and go try out a new state and see how it would work out for us. And but one thing that was important for my parents, that was utmost priority, was for me to be able to get an education. So if school was in session, I was in school. And it was sometimes a struggle for me as a kid. I just want a day off to be able to unpack my bags. My parents would be like, you can unpack in the afternoon. School's in session. We have to go to school. And so as a matter of fact, my parents would actually travel on the weekends so I wouldn't miss school. And so it was just really frustrating for me as a kid to just leave me. And so actually, one quick story that I like to share to show my parents and how stubborn they were about this. I remember we were coming down from Texas, and I must have been maybe in the 3rd grade. And I thought I was just so much smarter because my parents would always tell us, pack your little bag, your backpack with a set, change of clothes, your books, everything. And we would pack that last in our pickup truck. So it'd be right at the top and easy to access. So that way, if we got there late, not a big deal. We can grab our bag. We could get ready for school the next morning on a Monday morning. And so I was just like, well, this year I just won't do it. And my dad can't make me go to school if I don't have my stuff because my stuff's going to be way in the back. He's going to have to give me a day, Monday, to be able to relax at home, unpack, get myself settled. And I thought, I've got this. So we get there Sunday night, and my parents are like, grab your stuff, get ready, because tomorrow morning we're going to go enlist you in school. And I was like, I forgot. So sorry. It just slipped my mind with all the moving, all that stuff. I guess I'm just going to have to wait till tomorrow till we unload everything. And my dad's like, oh no, that's what you're wearing. And Beatriz lent her a pencil, Marisol lent her notebook. That's how you're going to school. And I was like, this? In this clothes? I've been wearing this clothing trapped up in a truck for 2 days, and you want me to wear this? And it's like, well, you should have known better. Just like, where's the flashlight? And I was out there digging through everything because I made sure it was in the very back corner, like, oh, it's way back there. Man, did I have to pay for it. And from then on, I knew, my dad would have sent me barefoot if he had to, but I was going to go to school. And that was just the stubbornness that really got, put into my brain that absolutely school is priority, and got me through high school and got me through college. And as a matter of fact, now I guess I haven't learned my lesson because now I'm a grad student too. After work, I'm out there doing my thing. But just really pushing myself hard because that was something that when I talked to my parents and seeing of my dad talking about how he's like, all of this that you see here, the house, the truck, everything is like, this is nothing compared to what we could have had I had the opportunity to go to school. He's like, I had the will, and he's a very smart man. He can out-math me, out in the fields. He's able to calculate all kinds of things. He's a very, very smart man. He'll throw up random facts about, did you know this building was blah, 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 built in this day by these people? And I'm like, how do you even know that? I don't know that. And he only went to 6th grade in Mexico, part of the time in school, and he knows these things. And it's just, he's a brilliant man, but unfortunately he was cut off at the legs, at the knees, and wasn't able to do the school. And that was something that he really pushed me. And so I kind of feel now like I have to do that for my parents, to be able to show them that their sacrifice wasn't for anything. And like I said again, those are a lot of the conversations we hear from a lot of kids. So that brings me a little bit to what I'm doing today. We're working in a campaign to bring these kind of stories up to light, to be able to really give kids a platform to talk a little bit about what their stories are like, what their realities are like, and empowering them to want to change their futures, to have that support that they can't find anywhere else, to be able to make it, which is something great that the Association of Farmworker Opportunity Programs does. What that is, very briefly, our association is an association of different member agencies from around the country. We have one in every single state, except for Alaska. I guess there's not any farm workers in Alaska. And we also have one in Puerto Rico and 3 members in California. These agencies offer a number of different job training programs for farm workers to try to help them move up within the fields or outside if they want to go do something else. They provide a lot of job training for them and different opportunities. And they actually used to have a youth program, which is the one I participated in. And like I said, those are part of the disappearing programs. That was one that helped me out a lot. But they used to do tutoring and other types of skills to teach kids so that they could be able to be successful in school. And I consider myself pretty successful. I'm happy where I'm at. So I guess, they absolutely used to work, but unfortunately they got zeroed out. But that's a little bit of what AFOP does. And one thing that these member agencies, as they were out there talking to farm worker families, what they noticed was there's a lot of kids out there for a number of different reasons. And they started off the initiative of Children in Fields campaign to do something about it because they saw that it was a grave injustice. So right now, the way the current child labor laws are set up, as you can see here, in non-agriculture, there's 2 different sets of rules, ag and non-ag. And I might be going over some of the basics with you guys, but I just want to be able to, point out this discrepancy in the Fair Labor Standards Act that my boss, which you saw in the video, was talking about. In non-ag and anything else, every other industry except for agriculture, if you're under the age of 12, don't even think about going to work. Your focus is school. That's where you need to be. That's what you need to be doing because you're a kid. Go have a childhood. Go play with your toys. Go read a book. That's where you need to be. But in agriculture, you can start working at the age of 12, an unlimited amount of hours outside of school. So that is the federal law. There are some states that have built on that, but the bottom line is, you know, for federal, as long as you're 12 and the school's not in session, we don't care how many hours you work, which is what allowed me to be working 80 hours a week during the summer. And then once you start getting into the older kids, you cannot do hazardous work, anything that's dangerous to you, if you're working outside of agriculture. In agriculture, you start doing it at the age of 16. Anywhere else, you have to wait till you're 18, till you're an adult, to be able to do dangerous work. Work that we know can cost you your life or cost other people their lives. If I'm a 16-year-old and I really want to drive a forklift because I think they're the coolest things and I want to get my hands on the big machinery, if I walk into Home Depot and say, I want to drive that forklift, they're going to be like, are you kidding me? You can't touch that till you're 18 because that is a dangerous piece of equipment. You could really get yourself hurt other people. All I have to do is walk across town, go to a farm, and at the age of 16, I can absolutely drive that forklift. Same exact forklift, same exact dangers. It's just in a different setting, so you can use it. That's the reality of how things are set up right now. And even once you're able to start working at 14, 15, 16-year-olds, you know, once you start working in non-ag, you're able to do it with, you know, you have to have a school permit. You're only allowed to work so many hours, only certain times. In agriculture, there's none of that. We don't have any of that. So as you've seen some of these conditions, I don't want to dwell too much on it because you guys saw it. These are the dangers that are in agriculture. You do have pesticide exposure. You do have... Do you guys know how farm workers go out to the restroom? You guys could probably, I'm sure you guys could paint yourself that picture. You know, having to be a young girl growing up and having to have no privacy, no real bathrooms out there. You have to carry your own toilet paper. You have to carry, you know, you have to be out there. You have no hand washing facility. It's lunchtime. You just crawl under a bus and just for some shade and just sit there and eat however you want. Your hands nice and dirty because there's nowhere. People go, a lot of the times, farm workers will go try to find some water, a container with water. That water you can't use. Pesticides are in there. Chemicals are in there because that's the water that's used for the plants. But how do they describe that water? How do they describe pesticides to farm workers? That's medicine for the plants. That's the way it's described. So your mentality is different. I never got any training on pesticides and the dangers around pesticides until I was 17. Was the first time I heard really about it. I didn't really know anything about it. So there's nothing that's out there for you to wash your hands, for you to have a little bit of privacy, for you to have any... No. There's none of that out in the fields. There's supposed to be. And even those requirements aren't that great. But there's just such little enforcement out there for any of these type of laws. And of course, you guys have been seeing a lot of the dangerous machinery that we talk about. A lot of the bending over... Can you imagine as a 10-year-old having to be stooping and picking up, you know, all these really heavy buckets over and over again, having to be doing, you know, all this work that you're bent over, stooped over. Working out in the cornfields was not easy for me to be doing detasseling because, as you could see, I'm not very tall. And these plants could sometimes be twice my size. I never knew corn could grow that big, but it can. And so I would have to be on my tippy toes and trying to reach and having to do a little jump and try to get all kinds of creative ways to be able to get that tassel off the top, you know, while we were doing the detasseling. And that wasn't fun either because doing that same thing for about 12 hours a day, it did wonders on my back and I mean, you would just walk into our house and you just smell the icy hot everywhere and see the ice packs that all of us were trying to, you know, our sore muscles because, you know, it's hard work. It's not easy work at all. And so those are the type of conditions that we had to be out there in, and all of it for what? For very low wages. I mean, if you guys think about the onions, how much you pay per pound an onion, right? Probably about $1 or so that you pay for a pound of onions at the grocery store. Well, if you remember at the beginning, the big potato sacks that were kind of stacked up, those to this day are about 65 cents for each of those huge potato sacks is what farm workers get paid. So you have to do a whole lot of potato sacks worth of onions to be able to even make minimum wage. let alone be able to try to make any money. And you saw the figures that they were talking about. Annually, farm workers make about $15,000 a year. And that's a family of them. And so that's, you know, a lot of, as one of my good friends, another activist, talks about, who's also a farm worker, he's like, we strive to hit the poverty line. That's one day I'm going to hit that poverty line. You wait and see. You know, that's the kind of conditions that a lot of these farm workers are under. And of course, this has huge impacts on your education. You know, having to have the broken school year, of having to move around between the different systems. It was really hard on me to have to fail classes just because I walked in late. I would literally walk in and they're like, well, you're not going to be able to make up this and this assignment, so there's no way you can pass this class. I'm like, I just got here and you've already failed me. And I later on found out that you're not really supposed to do that, but that happened to me, and that happened to me more than once, where I got failed the moment I walked in. And so that can really be discouraging. And then you try to catch up and you make up at the end of the year all the work to be able to pass, just to do it all over again the next year, and all over it again the next year. They're like, well, you got here 3 months late, so you have 3 months worth of schoolwork to come up with and keep up with your regular work. Here you go, congratulations. I'm like, I actually went to school while I was in Indiana. They're like, yeah, but you see, we have different school systems here in Texas, so none of that counts. That's great that you got A's. We're still going to need you to do 3 months worth. In 3 months, it's all due, plus you have to keep up with your regular schoolwork. And so it's no wonder why a lot of these kids, you know, more than half of them end up dropping out of high school. And so what are their opportunities for college? I mean, the fact that I was able to now even going to grad school is a huge anomaly. It's not the norm at all. And it took huge sacrifices, not only for me, but for my parents too, doing actual huge lifestyle changes of having to shift and try to be able to make ends meet without having to leave school early, you know, having to pull me out of school early or having to come back so late. It took real hits for them financially to be able to make that happen. And so a little bit, as I mentioned, what Children in the Fields is trying to do, one, document all of these stories to be able to share it with you guys, taking the photographs, taking the stories, things like that, and to be able to really build a lot of support so that these kids can have good educational programs and opportunities just like any other kids, you know, across the country. We're not asking for anything special. We're saying the same opportunities other kids have, that's the same opportunities farm worker kids deserve. And so we've started working on across the country. Those are the different states in which we've had our campaign, starting off doing coalitions, youth councils. So we've been out there documenting in these different states, which are some of the big ag ones. And we actually just put in for a grant, and we're hoping that we'll be able to spread out to more states. So hopefully we'll be able to get more stories from these kids and get more kids involved. And so, as I mentioned, we're out there creating community coalitions to try to be able to get a lot of grassroots support for our efforts. We're trying to be able to bring positive change into these communities, get the farm workers involved. The coalitions are made up of elected officials, educators, you know, the kids themselves, the parents, everyone, anybody in this community who is wanting to be able to improve the lives of farm worker kids one way or another. That's what we're trying to get them involved. As you could see, we've had everything from, you know, elected officials making proclamations, trying to change policies to better the lives of kids, doing educational, you know, presentations, doing giveaways of school supplies there, as you could see, for kids that really needed it in South Texas. The parents are like, we don't have money for notebooks for these kids. You know, there you could see in one of our meetings how they have a lot of the farm workers and different members of the community. And then over there, which was a very fun event in North Carolina, in which we did the Holy Moly. It's actually the name of the event. The kids came up with it. And they had actual mole teaching classes in which around teaching them how to make mole was also discussions about the conditions in which farm workers are living in and what people can do to participate. So it was free classes that they were having for the community. It was actually really great. And the food was fantastic. And then, like I said, we're having the youth councils, which has been really key. That's where it's really powerful to have these kids go out there, share their stories, really starting to get those leadership skills, which is kind of how I got started, and now you can't get me to stop talking. And to really be able to bring a lot of that attention to their community. As you could see, that play, the kids are dressed up in costume because they're using this very fun play to be able to teach farm workers about how to protect themselves from pesticides. They're getting their elected officials involved. They're putting, community events together to teach people about cesspit status and the importance of farm worker rights. It was also North Carolina where they had a photo exhibit in the Durham Golden Belt Gallery. And then they're also over here, like I said, bringing more attention to elected officials like Secretary Solis and saying, you need to do something about these farm worker kids. So we mentioned a little bit about what you're going to be able to do to make sure that the farm workers are being protected, farm worker kids specifically. First of all, what's key and most important and most helpful for us is people know about it. There's a lot of people that I've talked to that have no clue that this even happens, that kids are allowed to work out in the fields? Didn't Cesar Chavez take care of all these issues? I'm like, actually, no, he kind of got things started, and then somewhere along the way, it dropped off, and farm workers are still in pretty bad conditions. So we're talking to people and saying, support kids, support these programs, educational programs for these kids, support fair living wages. A lot of people have the misconception that because I buy organic, they treat their farm workers fairly, there's no kids out there. That's not true. Ask questions. Talk to them about it. Find out. And ask for them. I kind of would like my blueberries not to be picked by little 6-year-olds. Though I think that was something that's very important, and that all of us can't make those assumptions. Most folks are pretty conscious nowadays about getting more and more conscious about where their food is coming from. I think we need to take it a step further and make sure that there's these kids that are not out there whose opportunities are being taken away because we're hurting, their childhood, their well-beings, their educational opportunities, and they're sacrificing all these for very, very low wages. And so, just very, very briefly, I had put here a couple of facts, and I encourage you guys to go look it up, with the Department of Labor about the agricultural hazardous orders. That is something that has been really big on our radar right now. The Department of Labor has proposed updates to the hazardous orders in agriculture, which means what work is considered dangerous for kids not to be able to do. They've already updated it for non-agricultural work. Now she's trying to update it for agricultural work, which is the first time it's ever happened. It hasn't happened in 40 years that there have been any updates, despite the fact that there's more machinery, more dangerous chemicals, that kids are out there more and more. And so there has been a lot of misinformation about what this does. A lot of people who are familiar with them feel like, oh, you're not going to allow me to, to have my kid work alongside me. How am I supposed to teach him my traditions? You're not going to allow me to have, any kids to work out there in the fields, which is not true. None of that is true. It still protects the family farm exemption, which means, I can have my son out there alongside with me. Those rules don't apply. It still allows for kids to be able to be out there doing safe work, not dangerous work, but safe work that the secretary has been reviewing all these different types of tasks. So it's not like 18-year-olds won't be able to be out there. And a couple other things, it's not going to do anything to FFA or 4-H programs, and kids are still going to be able to go help out their neighbor. It's just you can't employ these kids to do things like apply pesticides. You can't employ a child to do things like, castrate a bull. Those are the kind of things that's like, how about you wait till they're 16, till they're a little bit older, instead of having a 12-year-old working in tobacco. Which, by the way, these kids who are out there harvesting tobacco leaves, they get exposed each day to the nicotine level is equivalent to 36 cigarettes. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that these kids are being exposed to, and the secretary is trying to be able to change that to make sure that these kids are being protected from that. So, find us. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter to hear a little bit more about us. And there's my contact information. So if you guys have, I know there's going to be room for a little bit of questions, but in case anything else, further discussion, Vash Ty Kelly is here, who's our Children in the Fields campaign engagement manager. So she's the one that runs a lot of the Twitter, the Facebook, and can put you in touch with a lot of really good sources. She has a few materials up here too in case anybody's interested, but that's a kind of a snapshot of what these kids have to go through, what farm workers have to go through. And, these kids right now don't have a voice. We're trying our best to be able to give them that voice, but we're only one organization. It really takes a community to be able to ensure that these kids are being protected, that they're being offered the same opportunities that every other kid deserves to. you know, to grow up healthy, to grow up happy, to grow up well-fed and with future. And those are things that right now we're not seeing with these farm worker kids in our own backyards, happening right outside here, Baltimore. You know, there's farms out there too, and there's probably kids out there working too. So I think it's up to all of us to make sure that these kids are having the protections that they deserve. So I open it up now to questions.
You had said to find out more about where your food is coming from. I guarantee you nobody at Giant knows where any of that stuff is grown, how it's grown. So what's the next step? Where do you find out how the labor practices are at farms where some of that food is coming from?
You know, and that's something that we do get asked quite often about, well, what do we do with grocery stores? That's kind of why a lot of the folks have been starting to move more towards, you know, farmers markets, to try to encourage people to do that as much as possible, because you do get to have face-to-face with those growers and ask them exactly.
The big buyers and the big
Yeah,
growers
exactly.
on grocery stores. So that's the nut that's got to be cracked. And how is that cracked? You know, how do you get people to sing up and to insist that stuff be bought from this farm and not that farm if they can't figure out which farm to?
It all started out, if you go back and think back to organic food. Once upon a time, you wouldn't see organic food in the grocery store. The reason it started becoming there is because it started becoming a big issue to people. I don't want pesticides in my children's foods. That's how it started becoming a big issue. I think it's up to us to start raising it into an issue of, I don't want my food picked by kids. And I don't think that that's something totally crazy to ask for. And so I think it starts the same way that we had to do the organic thing. That's the same way we have to do with children. You can find out about what farms.
I mean, I assume there's a certification program.
Not yet.
I mean,
That's the hard part.
It's hard. How do you know? You know, they can say, well, we think that's not good for children, but how do they know? How would anyone know if it is or not?
Yeah, I definitely hear your frustration. Trust me, we're there. And I think that's part of the work that we're trying to do is equalize the child labor laws. Then I don't have to worry about our kids out there, because we're making sure that the laws don't allow for kids to be out there.
You mentioned enforcement being lacking. How laws are in the books and not being enforced, would new laws make any difference?
Well, first of all, we have to make sure that our laws don't show that, because what's the reason behind those discrepancies? Just because we feel, well, they're not going to get enforced, doesn't mean that as a country, we shouldn't be reflecting two sets of laws of how we treat two different groups of children. All kids need to be treated different, you know, they're exactly the same and protected the same, and that's something that we can't allow to happen. Now, the reason that enforcement is so difficult, it's not because these, you know, enforcement officers are turning a blind eye. It's just that they're overwhelmed because their programs keep getting cut. And I think that's something that also comes back from us about where is the squeaky wheel. If people are saying that they want this, but they don't care so much for enforcement of kids, then that's where the money's going to go at when it comes to the government and the budgets. I think it's important for us to also make a lot of noise and to be supportive of these type of initiatives that, for example, Secretary Solis made sure that when she came in, she hired hundreds of new investigators and said it's important that that not just for farm workers, but all workers, that they have their laws, their rights protected, and that the laws are making sure that they're being enforced. And that was something that she went in doing. And those are the kind of things that we need to make sure that we're applauding, that we're saying that that's what we want to happen with every secretary that comes in after that. And so, you know, we still need to make sure that these laws are changed, because then when people are violating those laws, they still get punished for those. Because if there's nothing there, then what are we saying, that we're perfectly fine with it? You know, we can't be fine with it.
I wonder what's the economic impact, and that's the wrong statement, what's the cost of food? If all of what you would like to have happen actually happens, how much will food increase in cost?
Well, that's something that we also hear a lot about, people being concerned about how much is this going to raise my food prices. When we go back to the root of the problem of why these kids are out there in the fields, it comes back to because the parents are not being paid a fair living wage, not minimum wage, but a wage in which they can actually live off of. And, you know, because inflation might go up and all those things might go up, gas prices might go up. What doesn't go up are the wages for farm workers. They stay down there. Because if a grower, if I'm trying to be able to have a successful business, where I'm going to cut is down there. That's where a lot of the times it ends up happening. So that's where the real problem is, and that's why we need to support the fair living wage. If the families can be able to get a fair living wage, then kids don't have to be out there because they can actually afford daycare. They can actually afford to not have that extra income coming in. Some of the groups that are working specifically on labor laws and trying to be able to get a fair living wage have calculated that it will literally be cents to the dollar that they will add on for food. I believe it was, I'm trying to remember, it was from the University of California, a professor there that does very big studies, and I'm trying to remember his name, and he's escaping me right now, but he actually calculated that it would actually add $15 a year annually to families to be able to pay farm workers a fair living wage. $15 can make a difference so that farm workers can get paid so that they don't have to have their kids out there and have to be exploited that way.
You know, thank you first of all for being so candid about the sharing. It's very compelling. And for you to have the kind of attitude you have is remarkable. You got good parents. Got that.
Thank you. Yes, I do.
But this also appears to be, from the reading that we had from the Harvest of Cain, there was a comment that Terry made at the end of it that said we used to own our slaves, now we don't. And this is a clear violation of the 13th and the 14th Amendment. I mean, without question. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment called for equal protection under the law. This is the kind of thing that shouldn't happen. And we should make sure that it doesn't continue to happen. Because if we don't, the displacement of African Americans as slaves, for Hispanics as slaves, for Asians as slaves, for Indians, or whoever comes in the ethnic pool that we call the United States, but is considered an underclass at some point in time as their entry point, it presents enormous moral dilemmas for us. And the church, the United Methodist Church is really on top of this from the dynamic of the immigration piece and the exploitation of workers. But this is a real sad story.
It is.
It is actually past sad. It's criminal. And I actually frame it, poverty often leads to criminality. But the child farm workers are exposed to criminality in the field. It's
absolutely.
criminal.
It is. It is.
Criminal.
It is. And there's, going back to, if you contact me or if you go back to our Twitter or Facebook or get in touch with us, there's a lot of stuff that we're trying to work on in the policy level to be able to try to change some of that stuff. As I mentioned with the hazardous orders, we're trying to get organizations to sign on to our letter that we're going to be sending to Solis to show that there is support for the type of changes she wants to make. The same thing, there's been laws that we've been trying to get on the books. For 10 years, we've been trying to get the Children's Act for Responsible Employment, the CARE Act, to try to get it through, which would equalize the child labor laws. But what keeps happening is we don't have enough support from the masses because people don't know really about this issue, and that's something that we're trying to be able to change. So if that's something that personally or as an organization that you want to be able to get involved, please get in touch with me and we can be able to give you some real clear action items that you could do to help us out with that. Yeah, absolutely. Do you mind if I take her? She's been trying for a long time.
What really strikes me is that this is an example of institutionalized racism in our country. Mm-hmm. We have really avoided, and maybe that's deliberate on your part in terms of how you market your campaign, but one thing you have not said is this structural system is based on people of color being in one labor force and not, as heavily represented in the other labor force. So we sometimes think, you have that whole dialogue about, America with Obama as president, post-racist society. Bullshit. This is structural racism very clearly
absolutely
in our legal system. And, it has tremendous inequity which is a great marketing way. You know, if you don't want to raise the hackles of people who do not want to believe that we still have a racist society, then you go with the children message. But in faith communities, and particularly in progressive faith communities, I think you need to call out the racist aspect of this. And maybe my language is too strong, but I want to talk about
That's exactly how we feel.
One thought that I was having is, for us as people of faith, why when we say grace over our food, do we not have, I mean, what if there were a national campaign for there to be a grace that we all say, that acknowledges that our food came from people who do not intend to oppress, but whom we oppress by virtue of the fact that we cannot buy anything else right now, and we need to fix that. But we could pray to change that when we eat, every single time we eat, even if we don't know what to say at giant food. That would be something, that would be unique to us as people.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. Thank you for that. And I think that would be a great challenge for us, even just within here in the room, for all of us, if we can make that commitment to just keep that in mind. And to, as I mentioned, our biggest help would just be to begin with, just to share this with others and let other people know about the realities that these kids are having to go through, the sacrifices farm workers have to do every day just for us to be able to get all the great food that we get to be able to eat from around the world. So. Well, thank you guys for the time.
Yeah.
And I believe.
Thank you very much, Norma. And I had the opportunity to hear her a couple times and see that video a couple times. It really is a compelling story. And to kind of tie the two things together that we've been talking about, not only traditions, teachings on the dignity of work and workers, but also this very concrete example, and also our theme of sufficiency, to maybe take an opportunity to talk at our tables about what our own tradition has, and to maybe look at the discussion questions, and maybe invite us to focus on 2 and 3, and maybe just as a fun one, a little bit of 5, which I think is interesting. But you know, 3 especially, you know, the whole idea of labor and rest as being, you know,